Good morning and welcome to Channel 4 News. Recently, we've seen a large increase in reporting about recovery and conservation planning here in Australia, and some criticism about its effectiveness in protecting our endangered species. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by a researcher at the University of Western Australia, Sam Sampson, and he's here to tell us a little bit more about what recovery planning is, why it's important, whether or not it's effective, and some recommendations for it in the future. Sam, over to you.
Hi, thanks for having me on. So recovery planning and conservation here in Australia, it's outlined by the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999. These conservation advisors set out research and management actions to support listed threatened species and ecological communities to support their long-term survival in the wild. They describe things like action items and future strategies for land managers to help preserve these species.
Yeah, so that all sounds really important. Could you tell us a little bit more about what form these take here in Australia and what they look like in practice?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways recovery planning comes into shape here in Australia. We've got three main types of different processes and documents that exist here. First, we have conservation advisors, and these advisors, they provide advice about the threatening processes which affect individual species, and these can be adapted and changed really easily. The only thing is though, they're not legally binding or enforceable by government or ministers. Next up, we've got interim recovery plans, and these are draft documents used when a plan is required urgently, but there's just not enough information about that species to prepare a full plan. And finally, we've got recovery plans. These are fully fledged and written documents approved by the Minister for the Environment after really heavy consultation and scientific advice. These are legally binding, and the Minister must act consistently with the plan and cannot make any actions that would contravene these plans. In February of 2022, we had 410 recovery plans and 1,595 conservation advisors.
Wow, so it really does sound like there are a lot of different documents we're using to help protect our threatened species. Can you tell me why we've got so many? What are some of their benefits? Why do we keep using them? Are they beneficial?
So that's a really good question, yeah. What benefits do they have? There's a couple of benefits that these conservation advice and planning really does have to help protect our threatened species. They identify these species and the threatening processes and the research objectives we need to help protect them, provide a framework for our agencies to coordinate their efforts. They're also individually suited and adapted to the species biology. They set performance criteria and recovery objectives that must be met and covered for these species. And they identify the measures and the goals that must be utilised and must be met to help protect our species.
So it does sound like there are some really good benefits to our recovery planning. However, in the last couple of years, there has been a lot of literature and a lot of media coverage talking about some of the limitations to this planning. Can you tell us a little bit more about those limitations?
Yeah, so recently there has been a lot of literature talking about some of the negatives of our conservation advice and recovery planning. This is because a lot of those plans, they avoid prescriptive action, so specific measures. For example, 120 of our most endangered animal species with recovery plans list habitat loss as a significant threat, but only 80 of these plans had measures to limit habitat loss. Bottrill and colleagues in 2011 found there was no difference in species recovery status, regardless of whether or not they had a recovery plan, which is quite concerning. Is all of our effort going to waste? Additionally, in 2021-2022, the Australian National Audit Office found that the department is inefficient in its monitoring, reporting and support of the implementation for recovery plans. This is because the process is often long and lengthy, having to go through numerous committees and panels before they are approved. In 2020-2021, the average time for a listing assessment to be completed was 940 days, before we could then implement any kind of advice or plan. It is often only applied, now these plans are often only applied to popular and cute species like our mammals. Many invertebrates and other less charismatic species are often left off, and they have no advice or recovery plan.
Oh, that is really such a shame that there are some of those limitations you've described. Have you got any advice or recommendations you think government agencies could be using to make these conservation advisors and recovery plans any better and more effective?
Yes, I have got a couple of ideas that I think will be really beneficial to helping bolster and support recovery planning here in Australia. We need to invest more money and spend these funds cost effectively. We need to focus on protecting more species with less money, rather than spending a lot of money on one measure that'll only protect one species. We need to make sure that these measures as well, they're really prescriptive, precise and explicit, providing tangible and realistic measures on how to protect our species. We also need to make sure we're increasing community engagement and buy-in in the process. If you think about it, 70% of the land here in Australia, it's all privately owned. And if we want to introduce measures to reduce habitat loss or anything like that, these are only going to be as effective as the people supporting them. Now, there is also a call for a shift away from single species documents to multi-species landscape and ecosystem-based plans. And this is because a lot of the species here in Australia, they're impacted by many of the same threatening processes. So plans to mitigate against these can have widespread, cost-effective impacts. Also, we need to make sure there's more funding and investment into mitigating against the specific processes, rather than just continuing to monitor species, which is a really big recommendation.
Thank you for those recommendations, Sam. It sounds like here in Australia, recovery planning could be a really effective technique to help protect and preserve our threatened species, but it does sound like they are held back by some of those limitations you did outline. Those recommendations, they seem like really, really good ideas to help make sure that our recovery planning and threatened species management is at the top of the line to make sure we're protecting our threatened species. Thank you very much for your time today, Sam. That's all from us today, folks. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye for now. Channel 4, signing out.